Here we are at lesson 15E. In the next preview assignment and in the next class, you will need to be able to draw appropriate conclusions from observational studies and from experimental studies, as well as identify possible problems in studies that prevent researchers from making inferences. A quick reminder, observational studies, we're trying to make an inference about a population. In experimental studies, we're trying to make an inference about a treatment. So the types and characteristics of studies. Number one, describe the difference between an observational and an experimental study. I got to start it a little bit by saying the inference from an observational study is to infer to a population, and an experimental study is trying to infer to a treatment. A couple of other parts that we could mention. An observational study is one in which the researcher only observes something. And you got to find some words that make sense, that are triggers in your brain of, this is an observational. All I do is observe. And then you draw conclusions. However, an experimental study is one in which the researcher controls the treatment, or there is some manipulation. And when you're done, you are hoping to be able to say that something is causing something else. It's time for you to hit pause if you haven't already and complete at least question 2, but you may want to go on and tackle question 3. It's fairly lengthy, but go ahead and get an idea of what's going on with it, and then come back and let's work through these together. Starting with question 2, part A. For each of the following, determine whether the phrase best describes the characteristics of an observational study or an experimental study. The researchers might be able to infer causation. Only one of them gets that, experimental. Conclusions generally do not imply causation. That would be observational. There is a treatment group and a control group because you're trying to infer causation. That would be experimental. Blocking is used to control for confounding variables, and that would be experimental. We're trying to make it as pure as possible so that we can label that the treatment is causing the response. Part E, a double-blind study. A double-blind study is also used in experimental, and again, trying to get a pure situation so that we can definitely say what we've got is because of something else. Part F, the researcher studies but does not alter what occurs, and that would be observational. Continuing, as it said in the beginning of this lesson, that we're going to need to be able to look at and make conversation about observational experimental studies, talk about possible problems and ways that we can, in being able to prevent items that would prevent us from making inferences. We're going to continue to look at more studies, starting with number 3. A researcher is trying to determine the effectiveness of a certain weight loss diet through an experimental study. So she does a lot of right stuff. She randomly divides a group of overweight volunteer participants into 2 groups. All of the participants are weighed on a scale at the beginning of the study, and then they all meet with a nutritionist. The nutritionist gives the participants in group 1 nutritional advice and asks them to follow a weight loss diet. The nutritionist does not give any advice to participants in group 2 and tells them to keep their eating habits the same. Every participant returns in 3 weeks and they will be weighed on the same scale again. However, After stepping on the scale at the beginning of the study, a few participants from each group realized they're not happy with their current weight, and they start an intense exercise program at home. Let's just say, uh-oh, right there. But let's keep talking about this study. Which is the treatment group? Which is the control group? Is there a confounding variable? And if so, what is it? So when you're looking at these pieces, I was talking in class today about having various ways you glean information from a paragraph and start looking at it in general, trying to come up with a comment. And this is one of those, like you start looking at a treatment group. A treatment group means one actually gets treatment, and the control group means they get nothing. And so the treatment group in this case would be group 1, because they get to talk to the nutritionist. Well, so does group 2. But then they are told to, they got nutritional advice, and they are asked to follow a certain weight loss diet. The control group is group 1, where they did meet with a nutritionist, but they said, well, just keep your eating habits the same. But here, is there a confounding variable? And the answer is yes. Some of the members of both groups started an intense exercise program. And so now, any results that we find, we're not going to be able to say that the results are purely from the effectiveness of a certain weight loss diet. There is now at least one confounding variable. So still, examining this study, and as we talked about in class today, picking it apart. Be judgmental, be critical, be thoughtful at what is happening. And do this with everything in your life, but do it professionally, like on Part D. Why were the participants weighed twice, once at the beginning and once 3 weeks later? Well, the researcher wants to see if there is a difference. You've got the control group, you've got the treatment group. They're going to get weighed at the beginning and at the end, the beginning and the end. And they're hoping that the treatment group weight loss far exceeds or has a difference from the control group. Then they might be able to make some conclusions about this diet. Why did the nutritionist tell group 2 to not change their eating habits, and why were they not given any advice? So although group 2 did meet with a nutritionist, they were not given any advice and were told to keep their eating habits the same. Group 2 is our control group. They still met with a nutritionist, but they got no advice on their eating habits. This group later is going to be compared to the treatment group to determine if there are any differences. And again, keep looking at what would you have done the same, what would you have done differently, and any of the parts and pieces that we are looking at. Continuing on with this particular study, when the researcher finds the results, do you think the results are going to be useful? And then explain. Part G, was blocking used? And part H, if the researcher wanted to repeat the experiment to be able to draw better conclusions, what could happen differently? Make sure if you haven't already stopped that you pause, write down some answers, and then come back and we can work on this together. Looking at part F, the answers from this study, and write down of my thoughts what you want to, write down your own thoughts, think of different things, again, like how you would do this differently, and that'll play in at the very end. But even though the answers might be somewhat useful, all of the members of the treatment group lost weight. However, there's an obvious confounding variable in the form of increased exercise by some of the participants. For this reason, the researcher should look at the results with some skepticism. Part G, was there blocking used in this experiment? And the answer is no. How do we know? Well, in the study, participants were randomly separated, which is good, into 2 groups, a treatment and a group and a control group. However, this is not blocking. Blocking would be grouping individuals according to some characteristics they have in common. like in this group and in this group, you could have the same number of certain ages, the same number of a different set of certain ages, and matching any other characteristics so that then you can actually do two experiments. You would have a treatment and a control, and you would be blocking to control for certain characteristics and hoping that what you're studying really comes to light and that really gets shown as a difference. Finally, the researcher wanted to repeat this experiment and draw better conclusions, and so what could she do differently next time? The researcher could tell the participants to maintain their current level of exercise just for these 3 weeks. Another idea is to have a group fitness class for all the participants, no matter what group you're in, and ask them not to do additional exercise beyond the class. That way everyone is doing the same. In this way, all the participants would be doing the same amount of exercise, and alternatively, participants in each group could be blocked into those who change their exercise habits and those who don't. That concludes our lesson 15E. Go look at your syllabus to see if you have any more lessons in this week's assignments. If you do, keep going. If you do not, do a happy dance, and we'll see you next week.